Hi, welcome to One Eye on the Page. This is Scott. This is our third installment of Five-Year Battle, Stephen King, years 1984 through 1988. Contains a book that many consider, if not his best book, also containing a book that some people, I won't say the majority of people, but some people consider his worst book. We will debate that. We're going to start with The Talisman, written with Peter Straub. This is the first time that he co authored a book with another author. It is, to me, surprisingly, not as well loved as I think it should be. Maybe I'm just looking in the wrong places, but I have seen other people rank books. I have seen internet discussions about it. It doesn't seem to come across as top tier to some people. I love it. It's a very fantasy based novel. It's a epic heroic quest, different worlds, creatures, dying queens, a chosen one. It has one of the most lovable characters, I believe, in Wolf. It's the first book, so I'm going to have this in the first slot for right now. Following up on that, King, who hasn't done fantasy too much before this, follows up The Talisman with The Eyes of the Dragon, which is a book that he wrote for his daughter, Naomi, who doesn't or didn't like horror as much as I don't believe she does still now. But it's about a young prince falsely imprisoned for the murder of his father and his escape and claiming his kingdom back. It also contains a character that you have seen before in a different way. I won't spoil that, although chances are good you know who it is. Oh, I will also say that this, along with the Talisman, starts King slowly bringing the Dark Tower into his other works. Sometimes it's just a little bit. Obviously, the Dark Tower series contains other worlds than these, which is mentioned both in the Talisman and in the Eyes of the Dragon. Although there's not any world traveling that we see, but we do hear a little bit about it. It's a very good book. This is a very good time for King. Has a good streak. Probably, I would say, going from different seasons in Christine, Pet Cemetery, much as I don't particularly enjoy that book myself. The Talisman and Eyes and Dragon going to continue with a couple more books that are looked at some of his best books by many people. So I'm going to place The Eyes of the Dragon under the Talisman. And I'm not trying to damn it by saying this, but it is a children's book, and it is something that you generally can and perhaps should read to your children. When you compare it to the complexities of the book like the Talisman, it doesn't hold up quite as much. Then we have Thinner by Richard Bachman, which is basically the last Bachman book before Richard Bachman died of cancer of the pseudonym. Honestly, for me, Thinner is a mid-level Bachman book, maybe upper mid-level, because to me you have The Long Walk, The Running Man, and you have Roadwork and Rage at the bottom. You have Roadwork at the bottom, Rage just above it. And we have Blaze and the Regulators coming along. I don't know if Thinner is better than either of those books, but it's definitely not among his best Bachman books. The characters, along with many others in Bachman books, aren't particularly likable or even, sympathetic. Somebody you can have empathy for. It's a simple story, simple I say, about a man who, after accidentally killing a woman who is in the book called a gypsy, her husband curses him to become thinner, which he does over time. It's like the Incredible Shrinking Man, except with a gypsy Kurt, losing weight rather than height. And it's about his quest to stop it. And it has a what I would call a typical Bachman ending. Again, it's not my favorite. I wouldn't say it's one of my least read books, but it's near there. It's probably, considering how many books King has, I would say it's probably in the bottom 15 at least. So for right now, I'm going to put it at the bottom of the list. And then, and I apologize because I need to get a new copy of this, but we have Skeleton Crew, which is a short story collection. These stories expand greatly over what you see in Night Shift, which are generally much shorter stories. This one opens with The Mist, which is a novella. Many people know it because of the movie, but it's one of his more famous novellas, regardless of the movie. It has a different ending in the movie. I haven't seen the movie, but I know the ending. That can be debated whether that's better or not. King seems to like the movie ending. I'm not quite sure. It also, this collects some of his older short stories that didn't appear in Night Shift. There's probably a reason they didn't appear in Night Shift. Not that they're bad, but Kane Rose Up is about a serial killer, and it's a fine read, but there's not much to it. But it has excellent short stories in here, including The Monkey, Mrs. Todd's Shortcut, The Jaunt, which is a very haunting. It's a science fiction tale, but it's not really science fiction, it's horror. The Raft, which I believe appears as a vignette in Creepshow 2. The Word Processor of the Gods, which is silly, but I still like it. The Man Who Would Not Shake Hands, which is the second The Club story, which first appeared in Breathing Method, and which I wish there were more stories of. This is nowhere near as good as Breathing Method, but I still like to read stories about the club. It also has a couple of poems in here. Survivor Type, which is about cannibalism, self cannibalism. That one, I believe, relies more on shock value than story, perhaps. Morning Deliveries and Big Wheels are part of a novel that he abandoned called The Milkman, which I don't really care for these short stories at all. Grandma is a fairly haunting story. Perhaps my favorite story in here is The Ballad of the Flexible Bullet, because it's King writing about writers and writing about writing, and I enjoy those. And The Reach, much like the last rung on the ladder in Night Shift, is one of those novels, one of those short stories that has nothing to do with horror. It's just heartrending. I think as a overall collection, it doesn't hold up as well as Night Shift. Although I think there are some stories in it that are generally better than what's in Night Shift. I just think it has lower peaks or lower valleys in addition to the higher peaks. But I am going to rank this above thinner. I have a general philosophy that I mentioned previously that I tend to prefer novels over short story collections. But depending on the collection and depending on the novel, doesn't always work out this way. So next comes the big guns. It, over 1,100 pages long. Some call it his magnum opus. It pretty much collects just everything that you feel about horror and what it is to face terror as a child, and throws it all in there, and it's generally wonderful. There's one scene that everybody talks about now, which was a poor choice to put in here. I don't think it's enough to take away from the novel. There's some of King's best writing in here, especially toward the end. It has some black characters in here that don't fall into the magical Negro trope, which is nice to see. He still got some work to do with minority characters, but this is, I think, a leap forward for him. And it's just a wonderful thing. I got this in my house. We would open one present Christmas Eve. And I opened this Christmas Eve one year, and I finished it before we opened presents on Christmas. Probably, despite its length, one of my most read Stephen King books. So, of course, this is going to go in number one slot. And we'll see if it gets taken down. I don't think that it will be. Next is The Drawing of Three, the second Dark Tower book. I believe this is where the Dark Tower really takes off. The Dark Tower, the Gunslinger, is necessary, but it's not a great read, I don't believe. This is helped significantly by the introductions of Eddie Dean and Susanna. And I'm forgetting her last name because she has like 3 different names in here, but one of them's Odetta Holmes. Susanna Walker, or is it Odetta? Yeah, I mix them up, so. But Roland desperately needs someone to take the actual character growth slot because honestly, he doesn't have it much. Or it's glacial. Let's say it's glacial. Just great character development for both Eddie and Susanna, and it really gets the Dark Tower going. This one's difficult. The Talisman's probably a better book, perhaps, but I'm going to rank this above the Talisman because I think it's just more important. And it's also a great book. It's just I don't know that it's better written than the Talisman. But as far as how I'm ranking them, which is just not based on how well written they are, is number 2 right now. And then the streak King had going just continue with Misery. This is one of his not only most well written books, one of his best plotted books. As far as plotting, I probably rank it above The Dead Zone. And I don't know that there's any book that I can think of right now that I would rank above those two as far as plotting goes. It's about a writer. It's a joke, perhaps, but King just writes about writers very well. He writes what he knows, and this is a book for writers, for readers. Lots of talk about books in here. We'll see that again in Bag of Bones in the future. Again, another great movie made from this, starring James Caan and Kathy Bates, directed by Rob Reiner, written, I believe, by William Goldman. That's an excellent movie. Doesn't compare to the book. If you don't know the book, a writer gets in an accident, is rescued by his number one fan. She holds him hostage and makes him write a book because in his last book he killed off Misery Chastain, a character that he has learned to hate, but that many people love. There's little doubt. Honestly, if it wasn't for it, this would be number 1, but it just can't quite topple it, so it's going to be number 2. What some people consider, if not his worst book, perhaps his worst book before his accident, at the very least, or his worst book of last century. So, The Tommyknockers. It is not a great book. When he wrote this, he was deep in his drug addiction, and it kind of shows in the characters that he writes and actually the plot overall. It is wonky science fiction, characters that aren't particularly likable, and just aliens showing up, and it's not great. But I've enjoyed it more on subsequent readings than I did the first time I read it. Perhaps part of that is being an adult and just recognizing that everything's not black and white. And so characters that I hated at first, at least I can kind of see them with more open eyes than I did when I first read this when I was a teenager. But again, it's never going to be one of my favorite books. I'm going to rank this just above Thinner. And the final book of 1984 through 1988 is one I debated about including. I had different debates about what to include. Like, there's an audio book called Blood and Smoke. I'm not going to include that because the short stories that are in that are also in another collection. Or Blockade Billy, which was published separately, is also in another collection, so I'm not going to count that. This book, Nightmares in the Sky, the text is written by Stephen King, but it's mainly a coffee table photo book of gargoyles by F. Stop Fitzgerald. But because King wrote it, I'm including it. But also because it's a coffee table book about gargoyles, which beautiful pictures in here, you know. I don't know if this is still in publication, but if you want a book to put on your coffee table, this one, as well as any other one you could find, makes sense. But because the writing is limited, I'm gonna rank it in last place. It almost seems unfair to do so, and I did have an internal debate about this, whether or not to include it, but that's how it's gonna go. So we have 9 books from 1984 1988. And coming in at number 9, Nightmares in the Sky. Coming in at number 8, The Tommyknockers. Number 7, Thinner by Richard Bachman. Number 6, Skeleton Crew. If anybody wants to give me a new Skeleton Crew book, contact me in the comments. Or I could just buy one myself, but I just haven't done it. Number 5, Eyes of the Dragon. Number 4, The Talisman, written with Peter Straub. Also, if you haven't read Peter Straub other than his collaborations with Stephen King, make sure to read him. Floating Dragon, Ghost Story, my favorite Peter Straub book, Shadowland, or the Blue Rose trilogy are just some of the ones that you should read. Excellent writing. Also, check out his daughter Emma Straub. She doesn't write horror, but still good writing. Number 3, The Drawing of the Three. I did not rank that as that just for 3. Number 2, Misery. In number 1, was there any doubt, for the years 1984 to 88, It. So that is it. Number 1, that is it. Number 1, It. The Stand is number 1 for 74 to 78. Different Seasons is number 1 for 79 through 83, and now It for 84 to 88. Check out next time, and we'll see what's going to be number 1 for 89 through 93.